The last time I shared with you watch the water. And then I went to bed that night, and as usual, Holy Spirit showed up and started correcting me. I love correction because I like to know what's right and what's not right. Well, this lesson is called Save the Water. Every time I finish teaching, the teacher comes. This whole lesson is about watch the water disappear. I was thinking before about flooding and drowning. Well, what happens if you don't have water? You dehydrate. There is an entire element of watching the water that I missed. Holy Spirit is so awesome when He corrects me. Water does not leave our planet. What happens to water? Well, what does water turn into? Water turns into vapor, and that vapor turns into clouds, and the clouds condense and they collect and they get heavy. And what happens to the clouds? Well, the water drops back down upon us and it becomes rain. Well, right now we're having an issue, a big issue. So I'm going to go over a bunch of stuff, and hopefully it will enlighten you, because it certainly enlightened me. Sometimes we think we know, but we don't know a lot. We know a little bit. And then the teacher comes along and he starts teaching us, explaining things to us. So I want to start thinking about oceans. Well, oceans have what? Oceans have what? 3/4 of the water of the planet? They're sitting in the oceans. Well, how much of the ocean is water? Well, I would think, 100%, right? Well, no, that's not the right answer. 96.7%. Because the rest of the stuff in water is what? Minerals, salt, all kinds of stuff. Plants, algae, growths. So the oceans are 96.7% water. What's the difference between an ocean and a sea? Well, we don't have a Mediterranean Ocean, we have a Mediterranean Sea. Well, seas, for the most part, connect to oceans. But that's not always true. There are exceptions, like the Dead Sea. But most of the seas connects to the oceans. So many people, I thought that a sea and the ocean were the same thing, but they're not. Well, so now you know. Seas are smaller than oceans. So how does the water get from the clouds back into the oceans? Well, rivers and streams flow downhill. And what is the lowest level on the planet, on the surface of the planet? It's sea level. So ocean and rivers and streams and brooks are what? They're higher than the ocean. And what do? They run down from the mountains to the valleys to the plateaus, and eventually they get down to where sea level is, and they get down to where the ocean. So if you look in the summertime, you can see these lines of moisture going up into the clouds in the sun, and what that's the water is evaporating. But when it evaporates, does it leave the planet? No, it just changes form. It changes form, and it goes up into the heavens, becomes the clouds, and then the clouds come down, and it comes down to rain or snow or sleet or hail, and it works its way back down to where it started, which was down at the ocean, at the ground level, at the lowest level, which is the ocean. So how do we get water in our springs? In our streams? Well, we usually get water out of springs. What are springs? Springs are areas of water that the pressure on the mountains from the aquifers in the mountains comes down below into the valleys, and it works its way back up into the surface, and it becomes a spring, and the springs feed the rivers and the streams and the brooks and the tributaries. And then the springs and the rivers and the streams, they get stuck someplace in a low spot, like a bowl, and they become lakes. And what is a lake? Well, a lake is just a body of water that's like in a reservoir. It's in a hollow place, in a bowl. So we have fresh water, which is the water that comes from the rain and the snow and the sleet and the hail. And that's fresh water. That's water that doesn't have salt in it. And we differentiate fresh water and salt water. Well, we know the oceans are what? Salt water. Well, do you know that because the salt is being depleted from the oceans, that's changing the composition of the water? And so the Gulf Stream that goes up along the east coast of the United States is getting weaker. And as it gets weaker, it's not traveling as fast. It's not carrying as much warmth up into. Now, that you're going to get a lot from this. My friend Terry, he was a deep sea diver, and he spent a lot of his life working on oil rigs in the North Sea. Well, he said, Will, did you know that the Gulf Stream ends up in the North Sea? I didn't know that. Do you know the Gulf Stream comes up along the east coast and goes between England and France and ends up in the North Sea? And the North Sea is warm water from the Gulf Stream. But the Gulf Stream is weakening because the percentage of salt in the water is weakening. And so the composition of the ocean is changing. So we have salt water and we have fresh water. Now water can be broadly separated into salt water and fresh water. Salt water is 96-97% of all the water found mostly in oceans and seas. Fresh water is found in glaciers, lakes, reservoirs, ponds, rivers, streams, wetlands, and even groundwater. So we have lakes. We understand the lakes because we know about the Great Lakes, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan. But there's two lakes that are bigger than Lake Erie. One is the Great Bear Lake, and the one is the Great Slave Lake. And then we have Winnipeg and Lake Ontario and Lake Winnipeg. Well, we have some pretty big lakes in North America. Now, they're not all in the United States because they border Canada. They separate us from Canada. Which country has the most fresh water? Well, you're probably not going to be surprised, but the answer is Canada. Canada has the most fresh water of all the countries on the planet. So there's something else that's really important for us as humans, because if we don't have water, we're going to die. Well, what's really important is aquifers. What is an aquifer? Well, an aquifer is a water-bearing rock that readily transmits water to well springs and so forth. And we have aquifers in different levels of the terrain of the mountains and the hills and the valleys. And so when the rain and snow melt on a mountain, that water leaks down into the soil and gets into an aquifer. Now, what's really interesting is that a lot of the springs are aquifers from mountains that are coming down and being pressured up into the ground. In fact, my wife and I looked at a farm that we thought about buying in Virginia. And interestingly, it was an old farm from back in the 1800s, the old farmhouse, and they had a well house, and the well house had water pumping up through the floor, up through the bottom of the well house, and the water ran year round, all the time, and had for centuries. Well, where did that water come from? Well, that water came from an aquifer up in the mountains above it, and all the pressure just kept it flowing out of that pipe, which actually was a spring. It was a spring that had a pipe in it. Well, that was really interesting for us. So there's a really important aquifer in the middle of the country, and it goes from South Dakota all the way down to Texas, and it's the Midwestern aquifer. Well, that aquifer is the largest aquifer in the United States, and now it's 30% lower than it should be. It's gone from 100% to 70%. Now, what's happened to that water? Well, where did that water go? Well, it's being pumped out of the ground for irrigation mostly. But then there was a company in Texas that was pumping water out of that aquifer, and they were putting it through a purification plant, putting it in bottles and selling it overseas. Well, that's okay because, I mean, it's okay to take some water to share it with other people. But then we get up into Lake Michigan, and the company called Nestle's, I'm just going to say this politely, I don't like Nestle's. Nestle was pumping water out of Lake Michigan and bottling the water and selling the water to China because China's depleted of water. China doesn't have enough water for their people. So not only was China pumping millions and millions and millions of gallons of fresh water out of Lake Michigan and then bottling it and sending it to China, but they were taking these great big huge bladders in the rivers over on the west coast, and they'd take this bladder up the river and they'd fill it up with water, and they'd hook it up to a boat, and they would drag those bladders across the Atlantic to China for fresh water. Now they were getting water out of the rivers before it got to salt water, so they were filling up bladders in rivers, taking it to China. Well, Nestle's was taking the water out of Lake Michigan and getting rid of it, selling it off. Well, where does the water come from? Where did it come from in the first place? How did the water get into Lake Michigan? Well, some of it was probably from springs, but most of it comes from rain and from snow and from ice and sleet and runoff from the mountains. That's where the water comes from. Now, where does the water go? Well, we drink the water and we think the water's all gone. The water's not gone. It's just we use it, we process it, and we urinate some of it, we perspire some of it. But you see, water doesn't leave the planet. Water stays here. Now, there's a certain amount of water under the ground, and that's in the aquifers, and there's a certain amount of water in the atmosphere. So there's some really large aquifers in this country, but they're also, well, there's a Central Valley aquifer, there's a Columbia Plateau aquifer, there's a Denver Basin aquifer. There are a lot of aquifers, and all the aquifers, that's where the water gets down into the soil and it gets caught up in the rocks. So how do we get water out of the aquifer? Well, when I was a boy, we had a well, and when I was a little boy, we had a dug well. That's where they just dug down. Guys took shovels and picks, and they dug a hole in the ground until they hit water. Well, now they drill wells, or they pound wells, or they're either dug or drilled or pounded, and they drive a substance down into the soil like a drill or a blunt object until they hit water. And when they get down to a certain level, they get a certain amount of water. And if they go down deeper, they get more water. Well, I had an aunt up in New Hampshire. She lived up on a mountain. And because she was pretty high up on the mountain, she had an artesian well dug. Well, I thought an artesian well was because of the depth of the well. An artesian well is a well that's in an aquifer that has higher aquifers putting pressure under it, and it doesn't even need a pump. The pressure drives the water up the pipe and into the house. So my aunt had a 1,000-foot artesian well drilled. It was a drill well. They drilled it with a drill, and she didn't have to have a pump in the well because there was so much pressure that she had to cap it off and stop it from running out. So all she had to do was just open the valve and it would just flood out into the house. Well, that's what an artesian well is. So now we're going to go to the next level. We can't live without water. We can't live without it. How long can you live without water? Well, I'm going to tell you, I don't know what the scientists tell you, but I don't really trust science. I trust observation. And there were two brothers that went on a hunger strike, no food and no water. And in 21 days, they were blind. And in 30 days, they died. Well, how long can you live without water? Well, you can't live healthy without water for very long. But you can live without water a long time. but eventually you're going to die because you're going to dehydrate. So what happens if there's no source of water? What happens if there's no place to get water? Well, you can take water out of the air. We have dehumidifiers in our house because our basement gets damp. What's the dehumidifier do? It condenses, it gets the water to, it's hot and cold. Cold makes the water kind of run off of it. So it has this condenser in it, and the water drips into the tank, and we dump the tank out every day. Well, that's a way to get water. And there's a water machine called SkyWater, and that's a brand, if you can look it up on the line. And SkyWater makes equipment that takes the water out of the air. You can also collect rainwater. You can collect rainwater in barrels, but you still need to process it or clean it somehow. And you can either clean it by distillation or you can clean it by reverse osmosis. So atmospheric water generators, what these are called, are they bad for the environment? No, they're not. But they take a lot of energy. So you have to have a lot of electricity to run a dehumidifier or to run an atmospheric water generator. So we talked a little bit about rainwater collection. How about desalination? Well, how do you take seawater? You can't drink this stuff because it's too salty, and you just can't drink it. So how do you desalinate it? Well, you can distill it. And what is distilled water? Distilled water is water that's been turned into steam and gone up through a pipe into a condenser, and it's dripped back into a pan. So the steam has now turned back into water, and that water is pure H2O. There's nothing in it, because everything that's left behind it was boiled. The steam came up the tubes and came into a cold plate, and it dripped down into a container, and that became distilled water. So I hope you're getting some sense of we need to be concerned about the water, because China is running out of water. The Euphrates and Tigris rivers are running out of water. The Mississippi River is running out of water. The Colorado River is running out of water. And that's happening right now. Water is disappearing. And we've got to do something to protect ourselves, to take care of ourselves. And one way we can do that is we can collect rainwater. If we have rain. Some places aren't getting any rain. You can't make water up out of nothing. But the atmosphere has a certain amount of water in it, and you can take water out of the atmosphere, and you can turn that into drinkable water. So I'm asking you to pray for this nation, that God has mercy on our souls, because we've done some terrible things in the past. We've murdered 66 million babies. There's all kinds of abominations. I'm not going to name them because I'll probably get this cut off the internet. But there's a lot of abominations going on right now, and our Heavenly Father has got to be disgusted with what we've been doing to this nation. The Native Americans used to thank the animals when they killed the animals and used their hides and used their meat. Well, we're not very respectful as Americans today. Do you thank the cow that gave up his life to make that steak or that hamburger? I mean, I don't think about that. Native Americans did. We can learn a lot from the Native Americans. There's a lot that I want to share with you, and I've made it a point that I have a separate website now for health and wellness principles, and that's listed underneath of this video. But I hope you will think a little bit more about water. And if something happens and you don't have a source of water, I want you to think of things that you can do to protect your family and have more water. So God bless you. Just keep up the fight, will you? Keep up the fight. God bless you. Thanks.